A very good evening, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay. And first of all, an apology. I know you were all of you, all over the world in your hundreds of thousands, huddled round laptops and tablets and phones. And if you're in Peter Maritzburg, fax machines, waiting for our Monday live show, and it did not happen. Hopefully you did see the various messages we posted up. Unfortunately, a combination of airport delays and flight schedules leaving Scotland and getting down to London and back to South Africa meant we just could not get online at the right time. So my apologies. I'm sure your Monday was a bleak affair as a result, but we're back with a bang to more than make up for it with a really special edition on a subject that I think is genuinely fascinating. I think most wine subjects are, but this one in particular, because in the recent aftermath of Cap Classique celebration, September marking 50 years of Cap Classique in South Africa, and the upcoming International Champagne Day, which is just a couple of weeks away, it's a really cool opportunity to have a look at Champagne and Cap Classique side by side and get some expert opinion on how they compare, how they contrast, and what the story behind the two of them is. And we're going to be doing that with three very special guests, and I'll come to them in just a moment. Before we do that, first of all, this has got absolutely nothing to do with wine, but it's a story I want to share anyway. I dashed down madly to Cape Town this morning and then rushed back to be here for the show. The reason I did it and got on an awful flight about 6 o'clock this morning was to go and spend some time in Strand with Damien Willemse, the Springbok and Stormers rugby player. And not the Strand you think, not skipping along a beautiful beach and taking in the white sands and the water gently lapping up, but instead just a kilometre or two away, but into a far rougher part of Strand, a far poorer part of Strand, a part of Strand where Damien Willemse grew up, where he and his family lived in a one-bedroom flat, and got to walk through the area, meet a whole lot of people Damien had grown up with, and ended up visiting the house that Damien and his brother Ramon bought for their parents with their first ever professional paycheck. It's a heartwarming story and a really uplifting one at a time when we need these kinds of stories more than ever in South Africa, around the world, I think. And you're going to be seeing that on the Dan Nicholl Show in a couple of weeks' time, the story of Damien Willemse, his remarkable background, and also a wonderful project he's involved with from a conservation point of view, Plant One Tree, and he's doing some really cool work. So if you get the chance, have a little look online or look out for that on the Dan Nicholl Show coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Coming up before then, though, this Sunday, another chance for Roland Peens and Higo Jacobs and the team at Strauss to fleece you of your children's university education fund. It's another auction coming up. It's a live one, not one of their timed ones, a live one this Sunday, the Strauss Art Auction. I'm going to be spending some time with the three brands and their proprietors tomorrow at lunch over the new Joburg version of the Short Market Club as Luke Del Roberts comes to Johannesburg. It is a combination of Villa Fonte and the quiet, shy, retiring Mike Ratcliffe, as well as Butch Allight. Chris, we had him on the show not that long ago. Wonderful maker of white wine. And then, is he too young to call him the godfather of wine at the moment in South Africa? I suspect so. But gee, he's a talent and globally recognized. Expect some huge prices here. Sadi Family Wines and a whole range of vintage Columella, Palladius, and all sorts in between. So that's Strauss Fine Wine Auction Sunday morning. If you like collecting your wine, if you like the luxury stuff, there are some terrific lots up for grabs. Just do not expect them to come cheap. Right, into today's show. So who are we chatting to? Well, we've got a couple of names will be familiar to you. One maybe not quite so much, but it will be by the end of the show. We're joined by Ann Ferreira, the far better half of the Ferreiras. Bubbles has been on the show many, many times, and Ann joins us to talk Cap Classique, the Graham Beck range, but also the Peter Ferreira Bubbles, his own personalised Cap Classique, which has got rave reviews from everybody who's tried it. And then we compare those bubbles with those of France and head off to Jacquinot. Jean-Manuel Jacquinot from his champagne house in France joins us. And then as our mediator, giving us a bit of local opinion on the two and seeing how they shape up, is a man who's no stranger to the show. He really is a godfather of South African wine, a good friend of mine, Mr. Michael Fridjhon. Guys, welcome all of you. Lovely to have you on Dan Really Likes Wine.
Great to be here.
Hello.
Well, let's set the scene before we delve into the Cap Classique versus Champagne debate and start trading punches online and seeing how they both work out. With a little bit of background on the two, Michael. Cap Classique versus Champagne. For people who are watching this, they know they're both bubbles. They're probably made the same way because that's what people have heard, and that's kind of where a lot of people's in-depth understanding of Cap Classique versus Champagne sort of ends. So if you will, give us in a nutshell, Cap Classique versus Champagne, what are the similarities, what are the differences?
Well, let's start with what they have in common. What they have in common is that they are made from a second fermentation which takes place in the bottle. So contrary to many sparkling beverages, from kind of inexpensive sparkling wine through to Prosecco, and actually, to be quite honest, Coca-Cola, where you simply inject carbon dioxide gas, to make champagne and to make Cap Classique, the wine has to be the result of second fermentation in the same bottle in which it's marketed. So to do that, after the base wine has been made, the producer then has to bottle the wine with a combination of yeast and sugar, make sure it's properly sealed. And what happens is the yeast and sugar re-ferment inside the still wine, producing, firstly, the carbon dioxide, which gives it the fizz, and secondly, over an extended period of time, as a result of that constant exposure to the yeast cells, which of course are trapped in the bottle, that peculiarly creamy, biscuity, brioche note, which is a defining feature of fizz made in that style. So Cap Classique and Champagne are made the same way. Champagne can only be produced from designated vineyards in the Champagne district of France, and Cap Classique can only be produced in South Africa and in accordance with a set of regulations which are remarkably similar.
There we go. That clears up the differences between Cap Classique and Champagne in a very broad sense. Well, let's go into a little more detail, but also a little bit of history. And welcome Jean-Manuel, all the way from France. Bienvenue to Dan Really Likes Wine, Monsieur Jacquinot. Before we talk about the Champagne in a little more detail, give me some history, because the reading up I've done and a little bit of research I've done suggests that you've got quite a bit of history, and there's a really nice family story to the house of Jacquinot.
Well, good evening, everybody. In fact, we are grape growers since a long time. I have an ancestor, Mr. Henry Jacquinot, registered as a grape grower, who purchased a vineyard to a carpenter, and this is dated from 1764 and signed by the lawyer of the king. So this is one of the oldest documents which we have in our possession. Then after the big story, it's my grandfather. My grandfather was a small grape grower and a farmer. He went to the First World War. He had been gassed, and so it was not possible for him to run anymore his family farm. So he became a grape broker for Mercier, which at that time the biggest champagne house. He was buying grapes and selling grapes for them. And in 1925, the Mercier family asked him to set up a press, which he installed in 1929. At the same time, in winter, he was going on the French Riviera to avoid to be sick, and to sustain on the French Riviera, he was a sales agent for two champagne houses, Champagne Watteau, which does not exist anymore, and Champagne Chanoine, which is the second oldest champagne house, and he was a sales representative. And so after the Second World War, with the big boom of champagne, he said to his two sons, my father and my uncle, we have a vineyard, we have a press, a winery, a small customer network, why not making our own champagne house? So in 1947, they registered the brand Champagne Jacquinot et Fils, means and sons. And at that time, to be able to sell your champagne under your own name, you have to be settled either in Épernay or in Reims. So in 1949, he found the house where we are now settled, with beautiful cellars at 20 meters below the street level. And it's how the history of Champagne Jacquinot et Fils started, so 72 years ago.
And it forms part of this rich tradition of making extraordinary wine, extraordinary bubbles. In South Africa, we have a lot of people who make Cap Classique as part of their range. Give people an understanding, if you will, Jean-Manuel, just how dedicated the Champagne region is to only making this particular style of wine.
Yeah, well, in Champagne, we have what we call, well, in France, the terroir, the combination of soil, subsoil, climatic conditions, which are making the grapes so special, so particular, so beautiful. And so this is why you have a big difference between Cap Classique and Champagne. Champagne is a sparkling wine, but sparkling wine is not champagne. And we have to follow the regulation of the elaboration of champagne, started from the vineyard and finishing at the time of the disgorging and even up to the labeling.
Which puts you in a not dissimilar space to our South African guest from a production point of view, because although there are many South African estates who make Cap Classique as part of what they do, the Graham Beck operation, the Peter Ferreira empire, is purely down to bubbles. And we've had this conversation with Mr. Bubbles himself once or twice, but I think it's worth reaffirming. And this was a really important decision in the story of the work that Peter has done for so many years, setting aside the still wine and deciding, much as Jean-Manuel and his neighbors in the Champagne area focus purely on what they do, so Peter decided this was exactly what he wanted to do as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. When Peter first started and was approached by Graham Beck, the intention was just to make Cap Classique. And the farm itself, interestingly enough, had been flooded away in the Laingsburg floods and replanted by Graham Beck and the farm manager, who sat down with the Phyllis Hands and Dave Hughes book. So I think by the time Peter got to the farm, there were about 15 different varieties. So it kind of just morphed. And about 10 years ago, or a little bit less, Peter kind of went, this isn't working, chatted to Anthony Beck, and did what they do best and specialize in being a premier Cap Classique producer in South Africa.
Talk to me a little bit about the philosophy of how this is made, because we see Cap Classique made in the style of Champagne and given the different name because of the different region. Is it we are trying to make what they make in France, or are we trying to use the same method but create something that is distinctly South African?
No, we're definitely trying to create something that's distinctly South African. We have the greatest of respect for Champagne, and I think South Africa, again, was interesting, where we never went out to try and make or use the word Champagne. We started the Cap Classique Association almost 30 years ago. Michael was part of it in a great party in Mbabane in Swaziland. So we were one of the first countries to actually call our sparkling wine, or what the French method, the méthode champenoise, with a name that was generic and owned by us as South Africans. And I think the difference here is obviously the terroir, but as Peter keeps saying, we have sunshine. So that does make a very big difference to our production and what we make and how we make it.
One of the other things that is a little different in terms of Cap Classique versus Champagne, Michael, is what it's made from. And I'll get Jean-Manuel to give us some details on how he makes up his particular champagnes in a moment. But if I look at Champagne generally, what I've encountered, it's Chardonnay, it's Pinot Noir, it's Pinot Meunier, and it doesn't seem to stray much beyond that. Whereas in South Africa, you bump into Ken Forrester and he's making it out of Chenin Blanc, although Ken would try and make Shiraz out of Chenin Blanc if he could. I've had from Pinotage, I think I've had a Semillon somewhere. We experiment a lot, and I think it's part of the natural curiosity and sense of adventure of South Africa, but it does seem to be a wider palette from which to draw from when creating Cap Classique.
And that's certainly true, Dan, but in fact, there are a lot more varieties that are authorized but hardly ever used in Champagne. There are things like Petit Arbin, Petit Meslier, Arbin, I think Pinot Blanc is permitted. The reality is that after centuries of trial and error, they've got it down to 3 varieties that work best relative to obviously the terroir and the landscape. And bear in mind that a huge amount of champagne is produced on limestone-rich soils. And something that really would be very nice to hear from Jean-Manuel is a little bit about the cellar that Champagne Jacquinot has. He says 20 meters below street level. It is a historic site. It is entirely carved out of chalk. And without any kind of support, you walk through these hallways of carved chalk in which the champagne bottles rest and mature. And that predominance of chalk is part of the reason why champagne is made from Chardonnay and from Pinot Noir. In South Africa, of course, we can use whatever we like. And I have to say, which may seem to date me more than I'd be comfortable to acknowledge, I do remember the very first bottles of the Simonsich that the late Frans Milan arrived with in Johannesburg, roughly, I guess, in the mid-1970s. I was a very precocious 2-year-old. But the point about them is that he didn't have either Pinot Noir or Chardonnay available, and so he used the varieties that were available to him. And as you rightly point out, there are many producers in South Africa who very consciously decide to use cultivars which work for their expression of Cap Classique.
And extending that then, do you think we're at a space, there's been many, many years of making champagne in France and the trial and error to get to where they are today. How far down the road are we, do you feel, in understanding what works best for South Africa? Are we mirroring the grapes that they use in France, or are we finding that there are other grapes that our sunshine, our terroir combine to do an equally good job in terms of what we're making with Cap Classique?
And I think that's a double trick question for 2 reasons. The first is that there are real reasons for people to work with other varieties. You know, Crémant de la Loire is made with a little bit of Cabernet Franc, and it has Chenin Blanc in it, etc. So it's absolutely possible to make a champagne, a traditional method, sparkling wine, using other varieties. I think what has happened is that over the years, the aesthetics, the sort of style that the lovers of champagne have come to expect does put a lot of pressure on any producer who tries to stray too far from the traditional varieties, which combine to give a leanness and a precision in general to the wines that are made with them. But if I had to think about it, if I suddenly had to run my own champagne cellar, I would be absolutely certain to use Chardonnay. And it is a variety which performs extremely well in this country, and undoubtedly, and you will see this, the best, not always the best, but mostly it is Chardonnay-based wines that seem to appeal to the critics and to the judges. And so that would tell me that it has a place in Cap Classique. And since it is then so different from many of the other white varieties, you would have to ask yourself, what would be its natural partner, if any? And I don't know. That's why I said it's a bit of a wave of a double-edged sword. But I think Anne might answer that question and say whether in their experimentation they have found other varieties that they think are convincing in relation to the style of great sparkling wine.
Well, we'll put that to Anne in just a moment. And we can't expect you to have too complete an opinion, Michael. You are still very much in the early days of your wine journey. And I'm sure with time, there'll be a slightly more complete understanding of it all. Let's jump back to France and to Jean-Manuel. Tell us a little bit about that cellar. Michael's clearly smitten by it. It sounds quite magical, this underground treasure trove of champagne. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, in fact, you know that the Champagne region, we have a bed of limestone, and which is a sediment from 250 million years ago. And we have a belt of 400 meters in Champagne. And on the top of the hill of Epernay, you have the Miller stone, which protect the hill of chalk from the erosion. And so we are located on the top of the hill. So we have to go down to catch the humidity and the core temperature of the cellar. when you are on the Champagne Avenue, then you just have to enter into the hill and you arrive in the middle of the choke. So that is why in our winery, we have to go down with 106 steps to catch the choke, which is at 20 meters. The cellars had been digged in 1873, I suppose by hand, and it is considered as one of the most beautiful cellars of Epernay when we had been audited for the UNESCO World Heritage. And because there is no concrete, there is no bricks, it's a pure tunnel of chalk. It's beautiful, and it's with a very, very high ceiling.
It sounds like a place I need to come and visit, so expect me at some point soon. And full of your wonderful, wonderful champagne. We've spoken about the use of varietals. Give us an understanding, Jean-Manuel, what you're using to make your range, how you decided on what your process is in creating the wine that you make.
So we are a family estate. The vineyard belongs to the family members. So we have 17 hectares, 9 hectares of Chardonnay, 5 hectares of Pinot Noir, and 3 hectares of Pinot Meunier. The three main grapes varietal which are grown in Champagne, nearly 1/3 for each varietal, and a tiny bits of the old varietals which are now maybe coming up a little bit. And among the 17 hectares, we keep 7 hectares for us to create our champagne. We sell to the big champagne house the 10 other hectares because it's a family business. We want to remain artisan. We want to remain small, and we want to produce, and we have space to produce easily 50,000 bottles of champagne. The tradition of the house is we don't have a big name. We must go for quality. So that is why mainly our blends are out of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir only. Recently, we have developed 100% Pinot Meunier just to be able to show to the people, to the consumers, what are the three different grapes converted into champagne. Otherwise, we have the private cuvée 70% Chardonnay, 30% Pinot Noir. Symphony is 60% Chardonnay, 40% Pinot Noir. Harmony is 80% Chardonnay, 20% Pinot Noir. The tradition of the house is to go for very long lease aging. We are actually on the non-vintage private cuvée on the 2015 blend, bottled in 2016. So means 5 years in the cellar at 12 degrees Celsius in the dark. The vintage, we are just launching the Symphony Vintage 2011, bottled in 2012, and we are in 2021. So that means 9 years in the cellar. And we are launching the Harmony 2009, bottled in 2010, and we are in 2021. So that means 11 years in the cellar. Then we have the Blanc de Blanc, the Blanc de Noir, and the Blanc de Meunier. No more than 36 months of lease aging to keep the fruit character and not to have too much the autolysis character of our champagne. But definitely, if you want a very fine and very delicate champagne, you have to be with the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir only. The Pinot Meunier is maturing a little bit faster and not giving us, for me, some nice flavor in our blends.
I think there are probably a number of winemakers in South Africa watching, thinking, geez, 10 years and more in cellar. I wish I could keep mine for that kind of time. And it's those of us who drink it who benefit. Speaking of people who drink them, I see Michael Crossley is watching. Lovely to see you, Jean-Manuel, says Michael. Peter Ferreira, the other half of the Ferreira Empire. Hello, Jean-Manuel from Franschhoek. Good to have you watching there, Bubbles. And Peter throwing in another little note there. Cap Classique is a sparkling wine and not champagne, therefore uniquely South African. And then a query from Margie Brand. How about a short guidebook on South Africa's Cap Classique organized by Cultivar? I'd buy it. Well, maybe there's a project for Mr. Fridjhon to get stuck into, because I know he's got far too much time on his hands at the moment. And if I have a look at the makeup, we spoke to Michael a moment ago about that sense of trial and error. I think you're drinking some Blanc de Blanc at the moment. Michael's championing the use of Chardonnay. What have you guys found really hits the right notes for you in the South African context?
Yes, I am very much with Michael on that, and Peter as well. We both passionate about Chardonnay, in particular when it comes to Cap Classique or actually Champagne. I mean, it's not rocket science, and we're not going to reinvent the wheel because we know what works and we know what is absolutely delicious. So with both Peter Ferreira and Graham Beck, we use Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir. There are quite a few producers or more and more using Pinot Meunier, but in Champagne, which a lot of people, not a lot of people, but wineries or champagne houses that are using Pinot Meunier is because of the fact that it helps with the ageability and the drinkability of the champagne. South Africa, because we have so much sunshine, I'm still a little bit skeptical of whether it really is necessary. But we're also definitely seeing, as they are in Champagne, where people are moving to single varieties, particularly with the older other varieties that you can get in Champagne. It's becoming, a little bit more geeky, but really, really interesting. And in South Africa, I think we're going to be seeing that trend already. We don't, but people are starting to plant a little bit of Pinot Blanc, looking at Arban and all of those, trying to see if we can do something with that. But we've got one or two producers doing, obviously, Ken, the Shannon, there's one or two others, Silverthorn that is using Colombar and aging that in acacia wood that he gets from, I think, Klein Constantia, the Van de Constance, big 300 or 400 liter barrels. So there are a few people looking at diversity, but I think at the end of the day, for me and for Peter Ferreira as a brand, it's 100% Chardonnay and then 100% Pinot Noir.
You are a popular guest for many reasons, Anne. Nondebo Lushaba is clearly one of your fans. Yay, Ann Ferreira. I've missed this education, Dan. Hello, Dan, all of your guests. Can't wait for the fireworks. Cap Classique versus Champagne. And Post Sugar, love Cap Classique any day. I talk about the versus and the battle tongue-in-cheek because they really are, I think, complementary in so many ways. And how much time would you and Peter spend tasting champagne, looking at what's being done over there, not to try and copy or to mirror, as we've already said, but to see the trends and to see how you might be able to improve on an already fantastic product and see where you might be going in years to come?
Oh, as much as possible. So in a normal world, we would travel to Champagne at least once a year. In fact, Peter and I got engaged in Champagne, so it's very important. And I think I was age 12 when that happened. So it really has been a very long, very lovely journey. We have a great amount of amazing Champagne friends. A lot of them come to South Africa. I think they're incredibly supportive of Cap Classique and what we are creating, and as an alternative, as much as we love what they do. And also, I must actually just concur that Champagne Jacquinot, the cellars are particularly beautiful. They really are. I mean, it's a dream to be able to walk down there in those very beautiful chalk kind of amphitheaters, almost, I would call them, or yeah, they're absolutely wonderful. So yes, we learn all the time from what they're doing. We come home, we look at it, we try and replicate it, although, as I say, we keep the sunshine. So we are Cap Classique.
The education of all sorts of wine is such an important theme to this this particular show. And I'd like to ask you a question, Jean-Manuel, about champagne in France. In South Africa, Cap Classique and champagne, whichever people are drinking, still tends by and large to be something that's bought either in celebration, it's a birthday party, it's a wedding, it's an anniversary, it's a cause for much joy, or it's an aperitif, it's something we'll have a glass of before dinner, before getting onto the more serious wine in the eyes of many. Is that a different culture in France? Is champagne seen a lot more as something you have with your meal, as a wine to be paired with food and to be drunk in that sense, rather than simply the toast and then onto the red, the white, or the rosé?
Well, in fact, in Champagne area, it has been always a glass of champagne as an aperitif, and this we cannot change. Then after, with the worldwide development of champagne, with the French cuisine and the international cuisine, then everybody tried to pair champagne and food. And then the winemakers with the chefs had been able to create different blends according to the weather conditions, to the climatic conditions, to the food. And so now we have a big diversity of champagne. You know, we are around 4,800 wineries. Each and every winery is producing maybe around 6 to 7 different champagnes minimum. That means you are around, 30,000 different champagnes. And each and every champagne has got the signature of the winemaker of the house. And the big thing is that there is a big diversity of champagne, but with only one name, which is champagne. And so, of course, with the increase of the consumption of champagne, we can have champagne for aperitif, for food, for parties. For us in Champagne, the best is as a starter or for a party, but definitely champagne for elsewhere in France is for a celebration, for an anniversary, for a wedding, for an engagement ceremony, for any kind of very important moment of the life. You know, in my family, when a baby is born, the first thing which he has on the lips before the mother's milk is a tiny drop of champagne.
I was born to be French. What were my parents thinking? Belfast, Northern Ireland. 4,000 champagne houses. That's not a small number. How do you differentiate, Jean-Manuel? How do you get your brand out there? How do you get people to take yours ahead of somebody else's and create some individuality in such a big group of champagne makers?
Well, we are 4,800 wineries. We are all friends, but we are all competitors on the market. Among the 4,800 wineries, you have the 300 major, which are mainly selling 70% of the champagne around the world. Then after, it's a question of feeling, of experience, and then of what you like to drink. When you want to sell something, you have to taste your champagne. You must love your champagne to be able to speak about your champagne. And then after, I was speaking English because I was a fine winemaker in my previous life before joining the family business. And so I was not afraid to travel everywhere around the world. And so I developed my brand now more or less everywhere in the world, from South Africa to Australia to China, California, and Sweden. Then after, you have to move, when you have to work, and when you want to succeed, you are successful, of course, at the end. On the French market, then after, we have a beautiful cellar, so a lot of people are coming to visit us. Then we work with some independent wine shops because we are on a small scale. And then after, we do a lot of wine fairs in France, locally, national, and also international.
What a lot of diversity, says Peter Ferreira, and you could drink a different champagne every day for the next 9 years. Well, I think that's what you've been doing for the last 9 years and longer, Peter. So I'm not sure how that changes your life particularly, but that obviously appeals to John Katsunis. I am in, says John, on the 30,000 bottle challenge. I think we'd all love to jump into that. 30,000 champagne taste. That is a good challenge indeed, Michael Crossley. Headlined by the Jacquinot, which has clearly got a very bespoke feel to it and a lovely family story. Michael Fridjhon, this is a champagne you're quite well acquainted with. But what for you makes it stand out, both in terms of story and product?
Well, the story part you've already heard from Jean-Manuel. And it is a very interesting story because, you know, for a very long time, the champagne growers and the champagne houses were more or less at loggerheads. He mentions nearly 5,000 producers all in all. But what isn't mentioned is that there are at least another 5,000, I think, growers, people who simply harvest their grapes and deliver them to press houses, to the major brands. And the market is obviously dominated by half a dozen very big brands. And for a very long time, they had the, I suppose, the wherewithal, the commercial, the marketing nous, the networks to become so big. And if you think back to South Africa say 25 years ago, the only champagnes you would have been able to buy would have been established brand champagne. And in fact, my experience with grower champagnes started, I guess, in the 80s or 90s, courtesy of friends of mine in France who were living not far from Champagne. And so a trip to Champagne for them was a little bit like if you live in Cape Town, going through to Stellenbosch to do a little bit of wine buying. And so what happened over the time that I spent with them is that I discovered this treasure trove of small grower champagnes, of people for whom selling grapes was not emotionally or intellectually or aesthetically satisfying. It might sometimes be the easier route. You sell your grapes, you get your money, and you get on with your job. And so as I became more and more involved with grower champagnes, I made a real effort to identify people who, A, had the passion, B, did have some kind of a point of difference. It could be stylistic, it could be merely their enthusiasm. And if you just think of what you've already heard about Jacquinot, that it has this extraordinary cellar, that it has more vineyard than they need for the production of their own wine. So they can cherry pick, if you like, and make sure that the grapes that go into the Jacquinot champagne are always of the best quality. That, as you heard as well, they're not in a huge hurry to turn over their stock. And for many of the growers, and especially those that have come recently from being a grower selling fruit to being a grower selling champagne, to have that ability to fund your own stock holding so that your champagne gets real bottle age, time on the lees, time in the bottle, is actually something of a luxury. And in the case of Jacquinot, they've been in the business for over 70 years, and they've been able to build up that depth of stock. And then, of course, there's the passion of the owner, and there is the focus, and you'll see it in their champagnes, that the style is a particularly creamy style. It doesn't have that angularity, which is sometimes very attractive. But if you are looking for different styles and you go for one which is austere, perhaps a bit severe because that's what you feel like for a certain occasion, then you also need to go to the other side of the spectrum. And the Jacquinot champagnes have a richness, have a certain opulence, and have a lovely textural quality in the mouth. And that for me is both their hallmark and a reason to drink as much of it as possible.
Which I'm sure we would all love to do. Peter Ferreira clearly does. I love your approach, Jean-Manuel, says Mr. Bubbles. And of course, we're lucky to get Jacquinot from Reciprocal Wines. We often buy some. I've just come back from Europe. I have swiped my credit card and seen not one but two text messages come through so they can fit all the numbers on when they translate my purchase into Rand. You're bringing champagne in from France. Is it possible? And I know it'll depend on who's buying and what they consider to be reasonable, but are you able to still bring champagne into South Africa and sell it at a reasonably competitive price?
The answer is, in fact, obviously yes. And the extraordinary thing is how well priced champagnes like Jacquinot are, that, you know, typically for the cuvées that are available here, you're looking at, you know, 600 to 800 Rand a bottle as a kind of sweet spot, which will get you vintage, will get you obviously the blended Brut, etc. So those are not outrageous prices. Yes, there are obviously cheaper champagnes. There are obviously cheaper, highly branded champagnes. But to get champagne that is handcrafted and is not, you know, out of the price reach of people who buy good sparkling wine, I think that's a justification in itself for being able to supply this kind of wine and offer a point of difference in a market in which we are very fortunate. There's a huge amount of Cap Classique. There are more and more exponents of the craft and more Cap Classiques that are being made to have a kind of unique point of difference. And whether that is time on the lees, Blanc de Blanc, single site. We are seeing that the Cap Classique market has moved off a kind of ground floor level of around 100 to 150 Rand a bottle. And it's moved upwards not only using price as a proxy for quality, but because there's real craft that has gone into these particular expressions. So people who love fizz are already somewhere in a kind of price point where champagne of the kind that Jean-Manuel makes are not unaffordable. They're special occasion drinks. I don't think that they eat into the local Cap Classique market. And I think the premiumization of Cap Classique is in fact creating a meeting point for everybody. And that's really what fizz is about.
In effect, bringing the best out of each other, and that can only help both spaces, but particularly giving Cap Classique a lift as people see it in that champagne category where perhaps they might not have before. And it is the premium ones that are especially applicable in this case. So let's jump over to one of those and tell us a bit about this Peter Ferreira range, separate from Graham Beck. What makes it stand out? What's particularly special about this?
Well, I think, Dan, first and foremostly is that I now own my husband because the company belongs to me. So long story short is a few years back, we suddenly realized that Peter was heading the wrong way of 50 and would be retiring relatively soon. And bubbly is our passion for both of us. And we approached Graham Beck himself and said, listen, we think we need to do something. So it's a very small brand. I produce, with the help of my winemaker, Peter, about 2,500 bottles of each. We have a Blanc de Blanc and we have the Rosé, which is 100% Pinot Noir. And the idea behind it is that apart from the fact that we've now I've hocked myself, but I'm going to drink brilliant bubbly forever and a day, is that it has a minimum of 6 years on the lees, which in Cap Classique terms is quite an investment. We buy from different growers in various sites throughout the Western Cape for both of the Cap Classiques, and we use only the cuvée juice as such. So it's the best juice that you can get. Kind of if you squeeze a grape, that first little bit of juice is what we use for the Peter Ferreira. And so we've just released our third vintage now. So we've just gone into the market with the 2015. 2012 was our first release, or my first release, with a Blanc de Blanc. And the Rosé, was our first maiden vintage was the 2013. I'm about to release the 2015. We didn't make any bubbly in 2014. And down the line, we're about to release an Extra Brut, which is a Pinot Noir Chardonnay blend, but all vintage specific. And
being very welcomed. I see Notre Chaba. I've been dying to hear about the Peter Ferreira range. Well done, Anne. Take back your husband and sip away on the investment wine. Win-win. It most certainly is. All right, so that is the new range. Michael Crossley clearly approves. Delicious fizz, and always a treat to pop a cork. Let's go back to Jean-Manuel and the wine that you're drinking. I think you've got your vintage in hand at the moment. Just give people an idea, if you will, Jean-Manuel, your non-vintage versus your vintage, just at a very simple level, the difference in style and what drives making those two particular types of wine.
Well, the big difference between Symphony and Private Cuvée, Symphony is our vintage because my grandfather was a violin player, so that is why he gave the name of Symphony to our vintage. Symphony is produced only on a very good year. We are on the year 2011 now, and it is produced out of the oldest vineyards from the estate, and by chance we still have some vineyards planted between 1947 and 1951. So we have smaller yield, more concentrated flavors, more smaller berries, small grapes, a lot of taste, and this always making our vintage. And the target, it is to mature a minimum of 8 to 9 years in the cellar. So you must have the power of supporting the long time in the cellar. And so the year 2011 was a very special year, just after 2010, where we had a lot of botrytis. So everybody was afraid about the harvest 2011. So everybody has started the harvest very early in August. We have been able to be a little bit more patient than our colleagues, and we have waited 1 week more to get the perfect maturity of the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir, and we did a very, very good vintage. Even our rosé made this year was a little bit too high in terms of alcohol. We're at 13.1% of potential alcohol naturally, but it was very, very, very nice. And 2011 was a very, very special year. Harvest in August with a very big yield, so we need to have more time to get more flavor, and that is why now we have the complexity of the 2011. Our non-vintage actually is 2015. What Michael is having maybe is 2013 or 2014, but 2015 was a very nice year, and it's the first year that we have not filtered our blends. We did experimentation on Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir, and in 2015 we have decided not to filter our blends, and it is the first unfiltered champagne for us for our non-vintage. So the finesse of the 2011 is the tiny bubbles, and then the creamy character and the development of the Pinot Noir with some caramel notes, some brioche characters, and the Chardonnay, we are getting the vanilla, which is developing after 9 years in the bottle, in the cellar. And in terms of proportion of bottle, when we do a vintage, we do generally around 5,000 to 6,000 bottles in comparison to our private cuvée, which we do at around 22,000 bottles in a year.
If you are not currently licking your lips and wishing for a nice cool glass of champagne, then there's something wrong with you, I suspect. I must ask you before we wrap up, Jean-Manuel, in South Africa, we drink as much champagne as we can in between the Cap Classique, which we also love. What about the other way around? Have you drunk much Cap Classique? What do you think of it? And would I ever find a glass of Cap Classique anywhere in France?
In Epernay, it will be very difficult, I think. Well, in France, I think it's very difficult to find foreign wines, foreign sparkling wines, except if you are in Paris, of course. After everywhere around the world, yes, of course, you see Cap Classique, definitely. From Hong Kong to Japan to Australia, you will find Cap Classique.
And is it something you've enjoyed over the years?
Well, I was a flying winemaker before. I had specialized, of course, in sparkling wine. So I have tried a lot of different sparkling wine produced everywhere around the world. But Cap Classique was one of the best, of course.
On script, and glad to hear it. I think the thing to do really is, as you understand these two different producing countries, is to drink them side by side and celebrate the best of both, which I know is something that Michael does a fair amount of. In closing, Michael, as we look at the champagne and the Cap Classique, how far have we come with our Cap Classique, and can we hold out with a top South African Cap Classique and shape up against some of the very best of the champagne houses in France? Have we got that far yet?
The answer is we obviously have. I really do remember, and I remember being slightly astonished when Frans Milan arrived and said that he was making champagne method sparkling wine. And I remember wondering at the time, firstly, why he would do it. And you need to understand, and my memory may be playing tricks on me, but when Cap Classique, and it wasn't called that, was launched in South Africa, he was probably charging R2 a bottle, and branded champagne was selling for R6 a bottle. So you kind of wondered at the why of the effort. Now it's very clear that they are they're not competing, they are complementary, they are of different styles. There is a huge level of expertise in South Africa. There's a vast amount of shared knowledge. Peter Ferreira over the years has been the lecturer on sparkling wine and champagne at the Wine Judging Academy. And so the effort that he goes to and the effort that's been, the work of the association as well in communicating the importance of what to look for in fine fizz has, on the one hand, made producers much more conscious of quality because it's made consumers that much more alert to what is important and what can be achieved. And the truth of the matter is very simple. It's probably consistently the biggest growth market within the South African wine industry. For the last 10 years or more, it's shown significant year-on-year growth, as in fact has champagne. So the net effect is we're a market that's moved more and more into drinking good fizz, and a lot of it comes, of course, from our best domestic producers, as does a lot of it come from the Champagne district of France.
And that, I think, reflects very well on us as South Africans. If we're drinking more Cap Classique and more champagne, we must be doing something right. And I think what we've also learned in the case of this hour or so is that as much as I flippantly put it up as a Cap Classique versus champagne, they do really work together. Have plenty of both in your cellar. Compare them, contrast them, see what you enjoy, see what you like, but understand that they are in two different spaces and both very, very proudly so. Guys, it's been a delight having you on the show. Michael, always lovely having you back. And I think we've got some lunch to look forward to tomorrow, which will doubtless finish well after the sun has gone down. Anne, I'm looking forward to trying that newest vintage of your enslaved husband's Peter Ferreira, and some new ones on the horizon. In fact, Peter's saying, well, it is clear and important that I will have to travel with the owner of Peter Ferreira, and we will visit Jacquinot for sure. Well, I think I might be free for that trip as well. Jean-Manuel, merci bien. It was a delight to have you with us. Hopefully the next time we're trying some of your champagne together and not virtually, but really appreciate your time and being on the show and giving us some insight into French champagne, which was both invaluable and delightful. So Jean-Manuel, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Dan.
So there we go, with together with Ann Ferreira and Michael Fridjhon. What a lineup and what an education. Just for me, it's one of the reasons I love doing this show. You learn so much from people who have so much to offer and share so willingly, so enthusiastically, and with such entertainment. Nondreba Lushaba just wrapping up. Thank you. That was wonderful. Michael, thank you for that very balanced view. And getting a lot of comments similarly. And Rowan Smith, congrats Anne and Peter on that new Peter Ferreira. And Peter Ferreira, see you soon, Jean-Manuel. Expect an invasion of South Africans soon, Monsieur Jacquinot. And Grant Sauls, great show. Grant, lovely to have you watching as usual. Man with a great, great cellar back at home. Right, that wraps us up for today. We say goodbye to Bubbles, and on Monday, we jump into the world of pinotage. It was a little bit controversial. How is it standing at the moment? Well, it's International Pinotage Day this weekend, so we thought Monday we'll do a slight retrospective. And who else to talk to about pinotage than the great Beyers Truter and some of his diesel, which is pretty much as good as pinotage gets. Also, Aubrey Beersla is joining us. We've got De Wet Verleuren from Neertlingshof, who's the vice chairman of the Pinotage Association, Dani Statler from Kaapstad, and I think we might rope Rakes in as well for a real celebration of pinotage and kind of understand where is a grape that's got a pretty bad rap in some quarters in years gone by, but which I feel is entering a new phase of its life and doing so with quite a lot of diversity and excitement. But we'll get the experts' view on where pinotage stands at the moment. Also, tomorrow, look out online. We'll be doing something rather special with the wines of Duncan Savage and looking at his new vintages. We shot that just a couple of weeks ago. And there is that auction coming up with the Strauss team on Sunday. Until then, keep drinking great South African wine. Throw in the odd glass of champagne as well for some balance and for some education. And keep supporting a wonderful, wonderful industry, just as our friends at Pick n Pay are doing by committing to 25 million bottles of South African wine on shelves across the country this year to support the industry after the horrors of 2020. I'm off to drink some more champagne and some more Cap Classique. I hope you're doing something similar. Have a lovely evening. Huge thank you to Jean-Manuel, to Anne, and to Michael. I will see you back again live on Monday evening for some pinotage. See you then. Goodbye. To join the Pick and Pay Wine Club, simply SMS your smart shopper number to 36775. It's absolutely free, and you'll get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every bottle of wine bought. You'll also get a 20% discount on 10 different wines each month, a 25% discount on a case of wine, and a Magnum, some terrific competitions and invitations to awesome events.